I figured if I had a solid technical foundation on the instrument, I'd have a lot more possibilities. So the classical thing was a no-brainer, and I went full into it, and I really fell in love with the whole gamut of symphonic music and learning to play in a section.
I can't believe we're nearing 800 episodes, and this is the first time I've had this individual on the podcast. I'm Jason Heath. This is Contrabass Conversations. We're talking today with Thomas Fiorini, who I have been in contact with for years. I feel like he's my brother from another mother, I guess, in many ways. He is a member of the Brussels Philharmonic, originally from New York. He plays all sorts of other genres, plays a ton of bass guitar. He's performed with so many acts and just such an interesting person. And we connected today to talk about why basses tend to play late, or why bass sections tend to play late, or why they tend to get yelled at for playing late. This is the first of a few episodes that you're going to hear on the podcast they're kind of a byproduct is the wrong word for it, but the reason Tom and I connected for this episode was to talk about that subject, but I've been meaning to have him on the show for forever. So we talk about many other things, how he got into music, how he found himself in Europe, playing in Brussels, what that experience has been like, some electric bass concerto offerings that are coming up soon. That happens kind of toward the end. I find him a super inspiring, interesting person. I think you're going to dig today's conversation. And a quick shout out to our sponsors, Dorico, Ear Trumpet Labs, Practisman, Modacity. More on them later, but let's get into this long overdue conversation with Thomas Fiorini.
Hey, dude.
How's it going,
brother
man?
Jason. How are you, man?
It's funny because I feel like we know each other, but I don't think we've actually met in person, have we?
No. I think we know some of the same people, and we're about the same generation. I think you're a bit younger, but yeah, we never met properly.
How crazy is that? Wow. Where
the magic of the internet.
I know, right? Where are you from originally? Remind me.
Originally I'm from New York.
Okay.
I was born on Long Island, and I was raised in Saratoga Springs.
Okay, cool. How long have you been in Belgium now? You've been there for a while, haven't you?
It's been a while. Actually, I came over initially to Europe in 2000.
Okay.
To do my master's in the Netherlands. So it's like the southernmost city in the Netherlands, called Maastricht. And there was a teacher there at the time named Carol Hart. And Carol Hart was playing in the Concerto Orchestra. And Carol Hart was formerly a student of Homer Mensch, and that's where the connection came, because I was a Mensch student. Oh. So when it came time to apply for master's programs, that was kind of the unknown, but she somehow sold it to me, and it just felt right. And I decided to just sort of escape, and I thought I could be anonymous for a couple of years and just get whatever work I needed to get done in the practice room. But I got here and so that was in Maastricht, but I was renting a house just over the border in Belgium. And that's where the Belgian connection came. So, through a series of fortunate coincidences, I ended up starting to work, met my wife, and stayed.
Well, man, it seems like I've never been to Belgium. It's one of those random things. I spent some time, certainly not too far from Brussels and such in Germany, but I got to get over there. I've got one of my former students is principal based in the Westphalian Symphony. I forget what the actual German is.
Okay.
But his wife is there. They've got a kid, and I've been meaning to get back there and visit. And talking to him, it seems like at least his setup is quite civilized. It's he's been very happy. He's been there since 2007, maybe something like that.
Yeah.
I want to say.
Okay.
So
yeah, I made it permanent in 2003. I went back to New York after my studies for a year, and it's funny because probably sympathizing with your student, like as soon as I stepped off the plane in JFK, I was like, oh boy, there's that energy again. There's that, get into the car and the traffic and all that. And it's great. I mean, I'm from there. It's great to go back as a tourist now. It's perfect.
Yeah.
But there's something over here that for me worked. And I do feel at home here. I speak the language, pretty well integrated and civilized. Yeah, it's civilized. It's great. I love it.
Well, I've thought about Belgium a ton of times in all these great Belgian beer bars that we had one here in San Francisco. I can't. That's another reason I got to visit. Sadly, our local place here, which is in my neighborhood, closed pre-pandemic, sadly. And then back in Chicago, there's this great place called the Hop Leaf. It was like the first Belgian beer bar, kind of gastropub, kind of like that, with the frites and everything. And so I've spent a lot of time, imagining Belgium, looking at maps in my local joint. So can't wait to check it out in person.
It's true. In this relatively small country, there's something about what they do with the beer that's pretty undeniable. And if you're living here, and now I have my nationality, so I'm Belgian, you are very, very quickly a beer snob. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's so and I wasn't drinking before until I came here. Like, I was playing festivals and like outside concerts, and then it was, as cold beer after a gig sounds great. And then you start going, wow, this is kind of delicious. And then you start upping the game every time. And it's a pretty deep and awesome beer culture here. If you're into it and you ever get over here, I'll spoil you.
Okay. Well, I can't wait. Cause it's so interesting. Like the whole notion, I mean, we can talk about whatever, man, but I'll talk about beer till the cows come home. But like it's almost like styles don't exist in the same way as they do here. Like you have these more narrowly defined, and it's almost like every brewery kind of just invents its own style in a way. I mean, that's not exactly true, because I know there's doubles and triples and stuff, but it's just so interesting to like go down that rabbit hole. And of course over here it's so much harder to get the stuff. So but man, what a cool...
I got a buddy, and then we'll get off the alcohol.
Yeah, no worries.
But we'll get to the real stuff. But I got a buddy who plays violin in the orchestra, and he's really a beer connoisseur. I mean, he's tried them all, and he's really into the process, and he really knows a lot. He's a huge fan of American beers. Mm-hmm. He's really into it, and he seems to think that, like, especially in New York State, New England, some places in the Midwest, there are a couple of brews that he could tell you about that he thinks are as good as anything around here.
Yeah, there are some interesting things happening in New York State, and Chicago's got quite an interesting, like that area of the country, Michigan and Chicago, they've got this Midwest IPA sort of stylings that are different. And then, of course, out here in the Bay Area, this has been like ahead of the curve in terms of American beer for a long time. Yep. So it's fun. I now there's nothing to do because everything's shut down, but in the before times, that was a pretty common weekend thing, is like take the ferry over,
The danger is like home drinking, and that's, I think we're all probably don't want to admit how dangerous that is this past year. But my fridge is stocked.
Okay,
so.
Okay, yeah, mine is too. And now that we got the holidays, like we've got our local farmers market, and so a lot of some of the breweries in the area come in and sell at the farmers market, and of course it's closed this weekend because of Christmas, so we made sure to stock up and everything.
And are you in San Francisco proper?
Yeah, man, it's hilarious. Well, I am like in San Francisco. Like Have you been to San Francisco before?
No, I haven't, man, and I've never heard a bad word about it. So
yeah,
I'd like to get there.
It's a great place. We're in this neighborhood called North Beach. It's right next to downtown, and it's where it's Little Italy in San Francisco, and it's where all the beatnik poets hung out in the 50s, like Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg, and like these old coffee shops and bars are still here. So it's definitely it's the kind of like the last bastion of funky weirdness, old timey weirdness in San Francisco. Lots of old men with funny hats and stuff like that. So yeah,
Great.
It's a fun area, and the climate.
So it lives up to its reputation.
It definitely lives up to its reputation. Yeah, I mean, this place has been chaotic ever since it existed. Like this is one of those towns where you say, "Oh yeah, this town's great," and they say, "Oh, you should have seen it 5 years ago." It's totally over. But you look at reports from like 1865, and they were saying the exact same thing. Oh, San Francisco's done. So it's fun. It's chaotic. Everywhere I go now, everywhere I've visited in the world since moving here feels so clean. Like I go to New York City and I think this is the cleanest place I've ever been, and then New Yorkers look at me like, "What are you talking about? This is But it's the West Coast in general, and this city in particular. It's just kind of like there's like more trash, more graffiti, more. It's
really?
It's just kind of like a grungier place, and that's true in LA. That's true even in like Portland and Seattle.
Yeah, well, LA for sure. I have to say, with no disrespect to anyone who's from or living in LA it's a tough place.
Yeah.
And so every time I've been there, I've living in New York City for 10 years and being sort of from the area, I was never so nervous in America than being in LA. It was a pretty edgy place. So I don't know how it is now, but yeah.
Well, there's it's funny living here in Northern California. There's certainly like a New York, LA, you want to look up comparisons to those places, you'll find them till the cows come home. There's a lot of Northern California and Southern California. Like we think that they're a bunch of vapid, people in their convertibles reading their scripts and driving everywhere. And they think we're a bunch of like pretentious Patagonia wearing tech people, and they're both kind of true, but it's it's interesting. It was really interesting moving here from Chicago, which I think the energy of Chicago is a lot closer to New York than it is to here. It's not the East Coast.
It's different, but yeah, if you have to make a comparison, probably closer to it. Sure.
Yeah. I mean, and I've always loved New York. There's something that really clicks with me about that pace of life and the people, and it's a little more like you'll know exactly what someone thinks of you because they'll just like say what's on their mind. Where California,
pretty much right away, and it's not personal. They just got to get from A to B. That's
but that can be refreshing. And California is kind of almost the opposite of that, where like everybody's like chill on the surface and a little more like passive aggressive kind of. But it was really funny moving here because it's the pace of life is just so much slower here. Like nobody calls you back right away. Everybody's on their yoga retreat or they're on the hike, or so there's definitely and like starting to do gigs and stuff like that. There's just like a different vibe out here. It's definitely more laid back.
And how are you managing? Are you into it? You've been out there for a little while now.
Yeah, I've been out there 5 years. So I'm
5 years already. Wow.
Yeah, I know.
Okay.
I'm used to it now. Like it's my whole life I lived in a cold place and I just yearned to live by palm trees. I just thought if I could just live by palm trees, my life would be great. Now I have like 4 palm trees right out on that balcony there. I don't even notice them, right? It's one of those things I've just gotten so accustomed to, like no snow and
just part of the fabric of life now.
Yeah, and now this town feels fast paced to me, and it's hilarious because it felt so slow compared to Chicago, just even the city of San Francisco. But it's you just adjust to where you're at.
What brought you there, actually?
My wife. I would never have moved to San Francisco. She was a freelance harpist and then went back to medical school and got and is a radiologist now. So she came out here for residency, and I kind of came kicking and screaming because I had a good setup in Chicago, but there was no rational way to say Chicago wins over her and her medical career in San Francisco. I thought, okay, I'll just move out here and we'll make it work. And so that's why we're here. I would never be living in San Francisco were it not for her.
Good for you, man. I mean, you're a good husband, and you realize you guys had a great opportunity and you took it. So good for you.
Yeah, it's fun, but it's so interesting. Like the music world, like the San Francisco Symphony musicians here, like most of them can't afford to live in the city of San Francisco. Most of them are living out in, I can imagine. And I think it's up there with the Met in terms of pay, and it's one of the highest paid orchestras in the States. But the cost of living is just so hilarious. I think it's fighting with, and not like Western Europe's cheap at all anyway, no matter where you are, but like, it's fighting with Sydney and Hong Kong for like most expensive in the world. So we live really small in a shockingly expensive place in San Francisco.
Yeah, that's, it's true. It's not that the cost of living is that much cheaper here, but things are prioritized a little bit different. And I think, look, we pay a lot of taxes. So if you see like our gross loan and what we net and what goes to taxes from that, it's a lot. But we're getting something for what we're paying for, in the way of the healthcare and the way of the social systems and the way of the infrastructure. I have this conversation with family and friends often when they ask about that, and we talk about what system's better, and they think we're all socialists over here. So I kind of have to push back a little bit against the misinformation and the stereotypes. And I think we're getting more for what we pay for at the moment over here in Western Europe. I do think that, you can argue the merits of the system and all that, but especially being in the performing arts, we have reasonably stable jobs. The freelance scene around here, for me, has been fantastic. I've been able to play everything from death metal to country to jazz to symphonic music on almost like a weekly basis, this rotating sort of musical carousel, which has been awesome. And we're able to have we're not rich by any means, but we have a comfortable life, and we're not worried about our health care or being out on the street or living paycheck to paycheck. So it's been an interesting experience. And also to be an American and sort of observe what's going on in the last 10, 15 years from kind of like a 30,000 foot perspective has been also quite eye-opening.
My practicing companion, Modacity, this awesome app. It is so great for getting you to really think about your practicing. And there's what's called a deliberate practice mode. It tracks everything that you are improving upon and time spent in every piece. And it's just so great. Here is founder and CEO of Modacity, Mark Gelfo, on what the app does.
I use the deliberate practice feature in Modacity a ton. So what I'm logging my improvements, I improved my articulation today by using this strategy. And then I see that in my log. So I see all the improvements that I made, the strategy that led to that improvement. I see the star rating as well as the time spent.
It is so satisfying to be able to look back on your history like Mark's describing. I do that all the time, and it keeps me inspired and energized and feeling like I'm really making progress. Learn more at modacity.co. And if you visit our site, we've got a special offer for lifetime access for this app. Thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast, Modacity. This episode is brought to you by the Practisma Practice Journal. And here's author Susanna Klein on one of the biggest challenges about practicing.
Practice is so painfully incremental. That's just the nature of it. And so anytime we can kind of make it lighter, give it like a little jolt, or make it, that was a little better. Or we trick ourselves like, when we're talking about doing rhythm practice, some of that is for the fingers. A lot of it's just for our head. Like it gets you to, now I'm listening to these notes. Now I'm listening to these other notes more. Now I'm listening to these notes more. Yeah, you could just play the whole thing like god awfully slow, but boredom is terrible for the practice room.
I'm a big fan of this journal. I've gone through all 16 weeks myself on my own personal journey. It is so cool what Susanna's created. It's packed with research-based strategies to turn your ho-hum practice into extraordinary practice, and it really works. Learn more at practisma.com, where you can download the introductory chapter of the journal for free. And thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast. I'll bet. Well, moving to San Francisco in particular, the troubles of the U.S. Economic setup, or whatever you want to say, are like magnified here. The problem of homelessness is, it's about as bad in San Francisco as anywhere. And then of course you have Twitter, Pinterest, Uber, Lyft, Facebook, and Google just down the street. So you have like this just in your face sort of clash of a homeless person wearing no pants outside of Twitter. That's like a very literally outside of Twitter. And so it's a really troubling. So like pre-pandemic, it's not like this town was really rocking in terms of, everything wasn't firing on all cylinders anyway. So it'll be interesting to see how things shake up. In some ways, our neighborhood has become a little more interesting the last 4 or 5 months because so many things were shutting down pre-pandemic. And I think landlords are just sort of becoming desperate. So we're having a little bit more like artist enclaves opening up in some of these buildings. It's almost looking a little bit more like San Francisco, like 1975 or something like that. Or
interesting.
Yeah. So we'll see. Who knows? But the jazz clubs have been closed. Even the 5 years since I've been here, it's like you should have seen it 5 years ago. Some of the jazz clubs have closed.
Oh, you're saying it?
Yeah, I know. I am saying it. So it's so cool. It's so interesting to me to connect with people who are in different parts of the world and like the type of playing you do. I was talking to a bassist named Ben Hanlon, who's in the Melbourne Symphony, who plays everything, and the vibrance of Melbourne's music scene, in terms of classical music, but also jazz and all styles. It just, my jaw dropped because I thought we had some things going on here in the Bay Area, but oh man, it's just incredible. He could play every night of the week or probably every night of the month and play at a different venue and not circle back. It's pretty
awesome.
Cool.
I hear like Australia, New Zealand, it's kind of like paradise down there from people who have toured there and friends of mine who have gone there to work. Apparently it's amazing. Yeah. So, but it's nothing. I don't want us to turn into like slagging off the States for 45 minutes or something like that. Cause trust me, I'm really, really grateful to where I was raised and where I was born and the system that I came through, because I think an advantage of the American, particularly the American classical music education system or culture, if you want to call it that, it's really advantageous. And like, if you go through that system, if you go through your undergraduate, your graduate, your pre-college, you can probably be dropped anywhere in the world and get by, and hang. Well, and that's because of that's that culture that we have, this combination of competitiveness and also an emphasis on individuality and also solid fundamentals that can really take you a long way.
It seems like chatting with people that have gone overseas from the U.S., everybody I've talked to has landed a position, whether it's Europe or Australia, that's pretty much it in terms of people I've talked to. But yeah, it's interesting. That's something I've heard. A friend of mine named Jennifer Downing Olsen plays in Gothenburg, and we've talked off and on over the years about, that setup. She's very happy there. My former student who's in that Cologne greater area is
awesome.
is super happy. And it's interesting how different the training system can be. And then of course the employment in terms of, where you are.
Yeah, it's true. And I never thought that the two worlds that I had my musical legs in, being the pop and the rock and the lighter music, if you will, and then also the symphonic music, would ever sort of come together. And I mean, just within the Brussels Philharmonic itself, it's quite often or a few times during the season where I'm asked to play bass guitar in the orchestra, for certain productions. So I found myself like putting the bass down and like running across the stage or doing recordings with both. And they have a really incentivized film music culture here for the past 10 years, and a ton of great films. The orchestra actually won an Oscar for The Artist.
Cool.
Brussels Philharmonic played the soundtrack for that. They also did the soundtrack for The Aviator. Last year, just alone, myself, I did a soundtrack for Howard Shore. I did a soundtrack also for Ludovic Bors. So there's a ton of stuff happening around here. Maybe I shouldn't say it too loud. I don't want to get too crowded, but it's honestly, it's really great. And people always ask, they say where you're from. They hear that I'm English speaker, and I say I'm originally from New York. And they all say, what are you doing over here? And I have to just sort of in my mind's eye think back to playing like CBGBs and not even be able to use the toilet because there was no walls in the toilet, this legendary club. And, they have every little village over here has its own little like music school where they start kids reading from like 6, and they have their own cultural centers with like kitchens and bars attached to it and beautiful dressing rooms with showers in it. And I'm going like, yeah, why didn't I stay in New York?
Man, well, I got to get over there. I can't. It's funny. Every time I think of Belgium, there's this movie from several years ago, In Bruges. I don't know if you ever saw that. That's like
absolutely,
which is a hilarious, great movie. Of course, I'm sure that it has little to do with like day-to-day life in Belgium, but that's like something that's like stamped in my mind. That and beer.
Yeah. Well, sure. The last stop that I tell tourists to go on over here is Brussels, and the first one is Bruges, because it is really a jewel of a place. I mean, if Disney World ever existed in real life, it would be Bruges. It's really beautiful. Oh. And you can do it in like an afternoon. It's small enough where you can just do it by foot and take a little boat ride in the spring. It's awesome.
I was at a music festival maybe 2-3 years ago, and we were sitting around a table, all the clinicians, whatever, and it said like, how'd you get into music? And every one of us was like, heavy metal. How'd you get into, were you, because like me, I was a violinist, started playing bass guitar, and then my mom made me stay in orchestra, so I started on double bass. After several years of planning, I'm so happy that my course, Beginner's Classical Bass, is out on Discover Double Bass. This course is made up of 66, yes, that's a lot, video lessons which cover a wide range of topics on classical double bass, starting from taking your bass out of the case, which is very fun to film, and Jeff Chalmers of Discover Double Bass and I have a great blooper reel about that, and leading to different bow strokes such as staccato and portato. The topics also include posture, simple scales and arpeggios, left-hand technique, bowing technique, simple pieces which are fun to play, practice tips, and much more. You can learn more through the link in the show notes or just visit discoverdouble-bass.com/Jason Heath. This episode is brought to you by Dorico, and one of the things that attracted me so much to this app is the beautiful user interface. Here's Daniel Spreadbury, Senior Product Manager, on how they thought about designing this user interface.
It was building on that idea of having everything in its place and a place for everything, basically, and not just throwing everything at the screen and hoping that you'd be able to find your way through it.
I have become a true fan of Dorico. I have the full version. I use it every single day. I use it in my lessons. I use it for... I have become such a fan of Dorico. I use it every single day. I use it in my lessons. I use it for making arrangements and exercises and everything like that. There is a free version SE, Dorico SE, and you can do everything practically that the full version of the software lets you do. So if you're doing arrangements for a student, duets, or anything like that, or exercises, that is perfect for you. Dorico.com will take you to their page on Steinberg's website, and I can't say enough good things about them. Thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast. What was your path like?
Well, I'm just going to hang on that for a second, Jason, because you actually were pivotal in sort of kind of proving this hypothesis that I had. Remember a couple of years ago, I contacted you because I went back to school to finish my master's, and I had to do a thesis.
Yep.
So I did the thesis on crossover musicians, and more specifically crossover bass players. And I sort of, especially these days, I was thinking, wow, there's a lot of guys who kind of have a similar story to me, bass guitar players who were metalheads who ended up as classical musicians. And the bass itself lends itself to just opening more doors. If you're a bass player, bass is needed in every single kind of music and every kind of formation, large and small, pretty much throughout history. So I started going down this rabbit hole, and I spoke to a couple of guys who I thought maybe had a lot of in common with me. So I spoke to Jeff Allen, I spoke to Klaus Freudenstein, I spoke to Trevor. Everybody was a metalhead. Like, everybody started the same way. You yourself included. We spoke briefly about this too. You also are a metalhead. So that was my beginnings. I started as a keyboard player. I was fascinated by the synthesizer at like 10, 11 years old. Even going back further, my grandfather was an amateur musician. He was a drummer, and he had an organ in the house, and he just played by ear. And we moved in with him briefly when I was about 8 years old. And he was playing Christmas songs one year, and I just started playing them back, probably like most of us did. You hear something and you can just play it. You don't know why, you can just do it. So the keyboard made sense. And I spent, the next couple of years in front of the keyboard, incessantly working on it, got totally fascinated by synthesizers in the 80s. And then my cousin and I, who was a guitar player, we wanted to start a band. Nobody played bass. We were huge Rush fans. So he says, why don't you just try the bass, and be like Geddy Lee? And so he went to the music store for his guitar lesson. I picked up the coolest looking bass guitar I could find, and it was like an Explorer with a lightning bolt on it, headless bass. I was like, that one's for me. And I could just I think the keyboard training really helped, because the fingerboard automatically made sense with the half tones and the whole tones and the intervals. And I could just start figuring out songs right away. Like, the first thing I figured out was Tom Sawyer. And so I was off and running. That was it. That's how I got my start.
That's awesome. Yep. That sounds familiar. Tom Sawyer. You take me back to like late 80s Jason with my P-Bass copy and, pulling out my cassettes I got from Columbia Record, whatever that thing you got your cassettes in the mail from, and working on my Zeppelin and working on my Megadeth lines and Metallica and all that. So it's very
the common. Vitamins.
Yeah. So you did undergrad in the States then?
I did. Well,
was that at Juilliard or?
No, it was at Manus. But before then, I was working. I started playing double bass a little bit later. I was working as a bass guitar player. So I did Berklee and all that, and then started, looking for bands to play with. And briefly, I actually ended up in Florida with, Rob Thomas from Matchbox 20. We were actually in a band pre-Matchbox in Florida. And then I got a call to come to New York, working with a group. And then, like all rock bands, falls apart as soon as money gets involved. I found myself at 22, just kind of like listless, just not knowing what to do. And I thought, well, let me try to just, at least before I give it all up, just try to open my doors and pick up a double bass and see how it feels. And I contacted a teacher through Juilliard, a guy named Bill Ellison. And he went down with me to David Gage, and we just started looking at instruments. He's like, just touch them, just touch one that feels good. And I found one that felt good, and I could make a sound on it. And it kind of like, then the decision, I think you can sympathize with this, like, do you go the jazz route or the classical route? Mm-hmm. And I think this speaks back to guys who are metalheads. There's something about the classical aesthetic and the classical music that speaks more to that DNA of a metalhead. So I did my research, and I was going to jazz clubs and I was going to classical concerts, and it was kind of a no-brainer for me. Like, even if I wanted to fake it through jazz, even though I had some background with that music, I figured if I had a solid technical foundation on the instrument, I'd have a lot more possibilities. So the classical thing was a no-brainer, and I went full into it, and I really fell in love with the whole gamut of symphonic music and learning to play in a section. But I could barely read a note when I started, man. It was stumbling around in the dark for a couple of years, that's for sure.
Isn't that interesting? And it's so cool that you went down that rabbit hole in terms of crossover. Isn't that interesting how the heavy metal and classical interests converge like that? I was talking to Scott Pingle here in the San Francisco Symphony about this about a year ago, and he played this bass solo with Metallica to open
Absolutely,
up the
man.
and
so it's legendary. It's incredible.
It's probably the most viewed double bass solo. If he's playing an electric upright, but if you think about it by any metric, I mean, live he played for almost 50,000 people between the two shows, and then it's been on this Metallica concert documentary that's been viewed by however many millions of people. So, but it was interesting how Cliff Burton was really into Bach. Cliff, there's I don't know if it's something structural about the music that appeals to people. Certainly the virtuosity or the technical proficiency required.
Well, the grandiosity also too. I think also that has something to do with it. Sure. Yeah.
Super
You're onto something. Absolutely. Yeah. It's not just like, coincidentally, it's a thread I think that really runs through the music. There's a guy named Sam Dunn who runs a channel called Banger, and he made some documentaries about like Rush and Iron Maiden, and he made a film some years ago called A Headbanger's Journey, and it's basically the first like full-length documentary on the origins and development and cultural relevance of heavy metal music. And there's a huge section of it devoted to this very subject about the correlation between heavy metal music and heavy metal music. That meaning that heavy classical music is extremely responsible for what we now call heavy metal. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then that aesthetic as players, that's something that draws us in to that. And it's no coincidence that guys like Scott or guys like Klaus or like us ended up as classical musicians. I think there's a direct line between Eddie Van Halen and Paganini,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, absolutely. I even remember a buddy of mine, Andy Anderson, who's in the Lyric Opera of Chicago bass section. He was pulling out some period music, some Baroque ensembles, and some, you listen, depending on the group, I mean, there's kind of a metal approach to that too. Like I'm forgetting the ensemble now, it was too many years ago, but he was just playing me some Vivaldi. And it was like almost like a metal approach, only on gut strings. But it's
so heavy. It's true. It's radical actually, because actually I think that what we're doing as unplugged symphonic musicians or chamber musicians or early musicians is like the most punk rock thing you could possibly do in music these days. Mm-hmm. Because there's nothing left to shock. There's nothing left to turn up louder. There's nothing left to play faster. There's no more crazy makeup to put on. It's all kind of been done and been there. The most shocking thing you can do if you're a young person is to pick up a viola da gamba or pick up a lute or, pick up a violin and just play the hell out of it, acoustically. And so I think that we're connecting, if you are involved in this kind of performing art, it's quite radical these days.
Yeah, totally. It's been interesting going to some of the San Francisco Symphony's Music Now concerts, which are small. They quartets, quintets, solo players. They stage it a little bit differently. It's impossible to get a ticket. They're sold out immediately. They're in this other space there, and it's everybody. I mean, the median age is 30 at the most. It's interesting to. I sort of have had this impression in my mind just from my own playing or things I've read that everybody's gray. Nobody under 60 would even think of going to a classical music performance. And if it's framed the right way, or it's the right group, or it's the right place, that's not the case at all. I saw that in Australia too. I went to the Australian Chamber Orchestra, which and the way that they present themselves and stage things, it has a very sort of rock and roll kind of concert sensibility.
Oh, no doubt, man. I agree with you. And I think it's just a matter of opening that door to people. Mm-hmm. Once, and especially the live experience, because, videos and DVDs or that can only go so far. It can turn you on, but I think if you're in a room with a group of musicians playing this kind of music in real time, sharing the same space, there are very few people who would not be, at the very least, impressed by it.
Yeah. I can't wait until this stinking pandemic is over, like everybody in the world, because I will never take any concert experience for granted again. Yeah. Not that I ever really did, but I just think back to February, some of the things I was going through, some of the things I was playing. And if you look historically, usually about 4 years after a pandemic, there's this massive flourishing in the arts. So those groups that can stay and get through it, even here as we've like limited opening up and outdoor performing and stuff is happening. It's like people are desperate for those in-person experiences. And yeah, videos are great. Chatting over Zoom is great. Making music over Zoom is what it is. But there's nothing like that in-person experience, and especially like what we do. It's the magic. I think people are going to recognize that magic more than ever when we're back at it. I
agree with you completely, buddy. I think you probably felt this too. Once things did kind of go on worldwide lockdown around March, April, there was a scramble and almost like this pressure to do some sort of clever video just to show that you're still relevant. And I get it. And people were doing clever stuff, and I was entertained and I was inspired and impressed. But I thought to myself, like, if this is the future paradigm, I'm out. I'm out. Like, it's just because, I've already been doing it for over 30 years. And I've done it as good as I can do it. But if I need to become a video editor, in addition to a bass player, and spend all that time editing content, I have a lot of contempt for technology as it is. So if that has to be the future, then I'll just, I'll be picking up garbage or something going forward. It's fine. Yeah, but it seems to me that it will get back there. And just to further your point, when in Belgium, when the rules were a bit relaxed in the summer and people were starting to gather in restaurants and in bars in a small amount, I got lucky enough to play with some friends of mine in this little quartet. And they had a residency at a restaurant every Thursday. And I will never forget those times, those weeks that we had. They were some of the most joyful, meaningful playing experience I've ever had. And also the look on people's faces at the end of the night, I agree completely with what you say. People are hungry for it. It's been proven that it's so necessary, that what we do is not a hobby. It's also essential. Mm-hmm. And I do look forward to getting back to playing to some warm bodies.
Oh, I know. Like my neighborhood in North Beach here, they've been having, now we're completely locked down again for who knows how long, but luckily we live in a climate where we can do stuff outside in the winter. And so all these venues that have been here forever, these bars and restaurants and stuff, they've got the outdoor seating set up, and then the bands are inside, which is kind of a hilarious like reversal, but it makes sense. And so you couldn't find a seat in any of these places. It's been so great. And one of my bass buddies, he's like, oh yeah, I'm playing, Berklee, these are popping off in Berkeley and Oakland here in San Francisco. And he's like, pandemic? What pandemic? I have more gigs than ever, which is kind of funny. and yeah, those videos just kind of make me sad. When I see all the little boxes of people playing in isolation, exactly. And I don't want to do that either. So I've been occupying myself with various pandemic projects, which is actually what led us to talk. Although I would talk with you any day of the week, man. It's been, I can't believe it's taken 800 episodes to get you on the podcast, but my recent pandemic project has been making these bass history videos, which has been fun, and reaching out to people, and so I've been doing these lives of the great double bass players, but as stupid as I can make them. So that's my next one is Bottazzini, where I'm comparing him to Elvis, which I think I've got an argument that he's.
Wow, I'm very curious to hear you make this comparison. Actually, yeah, maybe the hair or something.
Just the level of popularity. I mean, if you think about it, and you read these reviews and like how someone could be so popular without any sort of television or anything like that. I mean, just like what an interesting life. And it's really fun photoshopping Bottazzini's head on Elvis from different eras. So that's part of the reason. But I've been putting out some of these topics and why does everybody think the basses play late, or why do bass players play late? And I'm a victim of that as much as anybody. I was recording myself yesterday doing this Philip Glass arrangement duo, and I'm recording in Ableton Live. I got the click on, I listen back, and I'm like, Jason, you're playing late, and it's just you in the click. Why? So that's a huge topic, but Any thoughts you care to share?
Absolutely. Well, it's so funny when you put that out on social media, and there was a lot of people with a lot of opinions. And let me first say, I agree with all of them. They're all right. Yes. And I like the ones who are getting more detailed about science and this and that, and distance and all of that. It's all correct. But the bottom line is it's true. We often play late. I hate to admit it, but it's unfortunately, there's a reason why certain stereotypes stick, and why there's a reason why we're the butt of the joke. It's because historically it has been true. There's a reason why there's that famous Toscanini audio of him losing his mind at the bass section, is because we're always late. What I think is a couple of things. There can be a culture in a bass section of playing extremely together. And if you are lucky enough to be part of a bass section with that culture, that it won't quite matter as much if you're a millisecond ahead, a millisecond behind, that the section is so together and it sounds like one giant organism that nobody will pick their heads up and say it's to this or to that. And we'll kind of impose our will on the rest of the orchestra to come with us. So I think that's my one thing that I would like to just posit that I would like to offer. Other than that, I was thinking about this because I knew we were going to be speaking, and the other night we were giving our streaming concert on Saturday, and we were playing Brahms 1. And I was just sort of noticing that the art of orchestra playing is really all senses and then some. So we are using our ears. We are feeling a kind of subdivision that should be going on through the music, that should be first coming from the conductor and then sort of somehow with body language conveyed through the principal players. I think what I don't see enough of in some of the younger players, Francois Rabas says it, right? If the movement is wrong, the sound is wrong. Try to imitate the movement of the principal player, whether it's with the pizzicatos or the down bows or your entrances. You'll have much more of a chance if you're all kind of dancing the same way, of at least creating that culture of being extremely together. Next is also doing little tricks that you learn over time. Watch the concertmaster for the entrances if you're together with them, and anticipate that, knowing that we're at a greater distance and that the strings take longer to speak. So there's the visual aspect of it as well. And also the whole orchestra, whether they know it or not, they won't start before us. They need to hear that left hand on the piano, and that's us. We are the drum and the harmony at the same time, which is a beautiful position to be in. But with great power comes great responsibility. So, so that's my 2 cents about what you put out there.
Well, yeah, no, 100%. And it's funny, never really having held down a steady job. My person in my shoes, I've subbed in a lot of different orchestras. I've been in a lot of regional orchestras, but I've never played with the same band on a consistent basis. And it's been really interesting, both how different bass sections with different principals or different members navigate that, and how it changes from conductor to conductor. I mean, what's your experience been like in terms of the person on the podium? How does that or does that shape things in your orchestra? I think that's a really interesting can of worms.
Excuse me, pardon me. Yeah, absolutely. It changes from section to section. And like you, I've also been freelancing all over the place and played different sections. And there's an art to that too, to fitting in right away and recognizing, what's too much, what's too little. But as it pertains to the conductors, it will be pretty apparent after the first reading from the first rehearsal what the tendency of the conductor is and how clear the technique is. Is it much more free? Is it more given to the orchestra to make those decisions? Or is the conductor a real stickler with their beat? All of them we have to kind of be ready for and sort of recognize relatively quickly. We are, as symphonic musicians, we are kind of in the business of compromise, and we're in the people business, and you have to adapt. That's the gig. Mm-hmm. But the conductors will certainly dictate, your timing and how much initiative you're going to take. That's going to become pretty obvious pretty quickly.
Well, I can't help but thinking back to 22 years ago, whenever it was when I started playing in the Civic Orchestra of Chicago, and Daniel Barenboim was the music director of Chicago Symphony.
Interesting.
And I remember it was one of those, give a beat and you could count a full second before the orchestra came in. And that's what he wanted. And how bizarre. And then we take maybe the polar opposite. I'm thinking back to playing some pit shows in Chicago where it's boom, you're on it, boom. And just how different, and you might be doing the same, those two gigs might be happening for a bass player the same week, or the same month. And just how different it is getting used to that. And especially somebody who plays in the pop, rock, theater world or whatever, where I think there's much more of an expectation of like being exactly with the, whatever that beat is, playing to a click, whatever, and then adjusting to that. And depending on the orchestra, and I think of like Berlin Philharmonic under Abada would be like an extreme example,
Sure.
where it's like, I can't even imagine how you conduct under circumstances like that. It's weird. It's like you're watching two different television stations, like the orchestra and the conductor. It's so interesting how people, yet good players, experienced musicians can kind of adapt to both of those situations. It kind of feels like you're putting on different shoes, but you get used to it. At least that's been my experience. For sure.
But I think the function of the job always remains the same. Mm-hmm. We have to drive the bus, whether people want to admit it or not. We do. So whether you are the lone bass player in the pit for Rodgers and Hammerstein, essentially they're kind of counting on us, and then when the percussion is there, we're making a groove together and we're making compromises in our time. Or if you're the last stand in a section, you're still part of that bus driver. So the function of the job does stay consistent in my opinion. Mm-hmm. But as far as like, you're talking about being the only bass player and coming from a culture of rock and jazz playing. The first time I played with an orchestra, I was 23, and it was first reading rehearsal at Manus. And talk about being early. I was like 2 days early for every single downbeat, and then it was really apparent very quickly that I had to adjust the feel and this whole thing that classical music, all classical, forget about bass players playing late, classical musicians play late. Mm-hmm. So that was, coming from different styles. Like you said, if you are a bass player crossing different genres, you have to know what you're getting into.
Yeah.
And you have to be able to adapt rather quickly.
I remember doing this recording. I don't know why we were doing a recording session back at Northwestern during my undergrad, but the orchestra was being recorded for something, and the conductor was Viktor Yampolsky, this very, very colorful Russian conductor, one of those, can dress you down with the most colorful, humorous, but also terrifying insults. And he was just tearing into the bass section for being late. And I remember thinking, that is total lunacy. We are not late at all. We are completely together. And then they play back the recording, and I'm like, oh, wow. We are late.
Yeah.
And I even remember thinking that, fast forward a decade, I played in this chamber music festival for years and years in northern Wisconsin, and we get a recording. I listen. I'm like, man, why? We were playing Trout, and I'm noticing that. So it's funny.
Sure.
Just maybe it's just me, but my upbringing or whatever. But yeah, I am almost never early to the party. As a bass player, I'm at on time or late.
Yeah. So you're extra funky. That's good. That's a good quality to have. Awesome, man.
Yeah. So what I'll probably, but if it's okay, I'll just put this out as a podcast episode. I've been meaning to talk to you forever.
That's great, man.
And what I'll probably do for these videos, what seems to work is I'll just like sprinkle in a couple things, as expert opinions. But have you got a couple minutes still? Because
absolutely.
Okay, cool.
Absolutely.
Why Europe? Why did you decide that at that point? Like, what got in your head to go overseas? I just think that's a really interesting decision for those that make that decision. What inspired you to head to Europe?
If I could go deep, it's actually quite personal. When I started getting into classical music, if you bear with me for a second, I was working as a personal trainer in order to make my living, in order to put myself through school, because like we were discussing, I started a little bit later. So I was an adult, I had a job, and one of my clients was working for Sony Music, and she knew that I was getting heavily into music, and every week she would bring me CDs, classical music CDs from their catalog. One of the CDs was Shostakovich Symphony 10. with the Concerto Orchestra. And the cover of the CD was the stage with the orchestra on it, which was the most impressive thing you're ever going to see, the stage at the Concerto. And that was the first time I'd heard Shostakovich, probably apart from the jazz waltz, which everybody knows, but that's the first time that I heard Shostakovich. And, it starts with that gigantic bass and cello solo, and that was right up my alley. And I was enamored with this recording and with just the cover of the CD. So flash forward a couple years later, when I was applying for master's programs, Carol had sent some literature to Manus about the conservatory in Maastricht where she was teaching. And she was playing in the Concerto Orchestra. Now, I couldn't find Maastricht on a map. I didn't even know that they spoke Dutch there. I was completely ignorant to it. But I got accepted to a few different programs, but something about that being the unknown and making that connection with that CD just sparked me to take a chance. Also, the fact that as much as I love New York City and I love being a New Yorker, I was looking for a reason to escape, to be honest with you. The lifestyle was getting to me. And sometimes you need to get away from everything that you know and have been around and all of your friends and your habits and just start fresh and I wanted to be a monk for a couple of years, like a bass monk. And that seemed like a good opportunity to do that. So that's why Europe initially.
Wow.
It's a bit long-winded, but that's why.
No, that's cool. And I'm picturing, I've only played the Concerto once in my life, back again, 25 years ago, or who knows when, but man, that stage, there is nothing awe-inspiring like that stage.
It's one of those rooms. Yeah, it's one of the great temples in the world for sure.
Now, did you grow up speaking another language besides English, or was
no?
Okay, but now you're fluent in Dutch. I'm assuming, or
fluent is
enough?
Something I would never say because I don't want to disrespect the language, but I can speak it. And funnily enough, last Wednesday I had to do Brussels Philharmonic does a podcast series, and I had to do. They asked me to do a podcast talking about the creation of the world by Darius Milhaud. And the stipulation was that I do it all in Dutch. So I did it. This whole 90-minute conversation in Dutch. So that was a huge, I was so stressed, man. And the night before I had I'm so, with these kinds of things, I'm so OCD and I had all my notes and I did, all my questions out in the two different languages. And I was practicing with my wife and she's like, I don't understand anything you're saying. So I was having this low grade panic attack that I was going to completely botch it. But somehow I got there and I started speaking and warming up with the guys and it went well. So yeah, to answer your question, I do speak the language and I was teaching in music schools for the past couple of years too with little kids and they're not speaking English. So I had to get better quick.
Well, yeah, I'm so curious because I've been, and it's, the best way to learn a language, as everyone knows, is to just throw yourself into a culture where that's the language, trial by fire. I've been banging away on my Spanish for the last couple of years because I find myself in Mexico or in Spain or somewhere, and I'm sick of being the ugly American that can't speak at all. But I'm what little Spanish I know, I'm always terrified to break out in a situation. But I was in Spain working with little kids up in northwestern Spain for a few weeks, and English is not really, nobody's really speaking English up there, and so it was trial by fire, try to teach, and that was helpful. But what was it like moving over there, not speaking Dutch, and that how long did it take before you felt like you could communicate with people? I mean, I'm sure English is pretty commonly or probably almost universally spoken, but still, I'm guessing your rehearsals are in Dutch. Maybe not, but
well, no, that varies. You hit on a very important point, actually. In what you want to call the lowlands, Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg to some extent, English is pretty commonly spoken, and there are many people who are native born to these countries who speak English better than I do, if I'm being fair. So it's really a luxury as an English speaker to land in this part of the world. Now, as far as learning the other language, now Belgium, I don't know if you know about it, but the north part speaks Flemish, which is a dialect of Dutch. The southern part, speaks French.
Right. Yeah.
And
I'm so
also
confused. Like because isn't there a little German kind? You're not too far
also
from Germany.
right.
Okay.
There's a small province on the east that speaks German as well. Right. So actually, all the official federal documents are in 3 languages, which is there's a little bit of tension in this country about political tension about all the different languages, particularly between the North and South, and how that who's contributing what as far as tax revenue and all that. But again, as someone who comes from a one language country, and we're pretty limited in our scope, I find that as part of being the identity of the country, I find it extremely advantageous because also Belgium is sort of that country of compromise, that country of bureaucracy, of taking a very long time to come to consensus. And I find that that's a bit in the national identity. I find it very attractive.
That's interesting. Yeah.
But I learned, to get back to your original question, I learned the language primarily from watching English films and television with the Dutch subtitles.
Oh, wow.
And actually, like German, Dutch has a lot of similarities to, well, I should say English is a Germanic language. So if you start understanding the correlation between the pronunciation, you start making associations basically, and over time you pick it up.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting with German, and again, my experiences in Germany, everybody speaks English better than I do. So the moment that I tried to say anything in German, my like whopping dozen words I know, they would immediately switch to English. But I found myself going down some YouTube rabbit holes, watching Carlos Kleiber rehearsals and such. And it's if I can fool myself into thinking I understand what's going on because the cadence is so similar and the structure of the language is so similar, and then at a certain point I realized like I actually don't understand anything that they're saying, but I kind of get the the structure of the language. So that's interesting.
It's you asked about rehearsals, and actually our current music director is Stéphane Denève, and he's a Frenchman, but he speaks English in the rehearsals, which for me is great. But there will be conductors who speak French because Brussels is a French-speaking town. Which is fine. I can get by with understanding it. Don't ask me to speak it because that language coming out of this face is not pretty. So, but what's critical to know is numbers. That's really critical to know. If you can recognize the numbers in the languages, then or letters, and you can always sort of find where you are.
Yeah, well, in for so many reasons in life, that's helpful, but especially if you're rehearsing, right? Yeah, if you just know where to start,
that's it. The rest is it's all downhill skiing after that. So,
well, I remember my former teacher Michael Hovnanian in the Chicago Symphony telling me back when Schulte was conducting the orchestra, Schulte had the craziest accent because it was like a mixture. It was like English but barely, and then there was just all these things, and so he'd get up there and Schulte would just go like rah, rah, and he'd say something and people knew in the orchestra he just sounded like he just barked nonsense, but it was a rehearsal number or letter or something, and so you'd see all the principal players turn around and go, we're starting at G, and so you have to have this like weird communication. So
they understood Schultish.
Some of them understood Schultish. Yeah, exactly. Tom, awesome. You rock, man. I'm so. It's so great to hang out with you over Zoom. It's funny because I know we haven't met, but I feel like because we've been in touch over the years, I feel like I know you well. But one of these days, I will certainly be back in your neck of the woods sooner rather than later. The last thing I did before being locked in my house for the last 10 months was I was in the UK, and so not too far, closer to you than not.
Short swim, but exactly.
Short swim, yeah. So I'm long overdue for France, Germany, Belgium.
Well, buddy, you're always welcome over at our place, man. I'd love to show you around. I'd love to talk more in depth. I'd love to introduce you to some people and see where we work and all that.
I'm sorry. Go, well, once we get out of this pandemic, my plan, what I had started to do, which has been thwarted, like everybody's plans for the next few years, is go somewhere in the world for a couple weeks and just be like a podcast-based journalist reporter sort of person. I did that in New York City in 2018, which is awesome. I could go to New York every month and not run out of things to do. And then I did that in Australia for a couple of weeks in the fall.
Yeah, I really enjoyed when you did that, man. It was like opening up a new world for everybody. The players and the quality of the music down there, geez, they were great.
Well, well, thank you. And I plan to do more with that. I've been now in this pandemic, I've been buying camera gear and stuff like that, and really try to like go in deep for so obviously it's a no brainer to go and visit France and Germany and it could take a month. And I think that's personally, it's fun. Why not? And then it's great to chat with anybody over Zoom or the like, but man, how great was it especially in Australia, to go and like see a concert in the group that person's playing with and hang out with them and really get to know them. And so more of that to come for sure. So that's an extremely long way of saying I will definitely be in your in your neck of the woods, as soon as travel becomes less terrifying.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, man, I got to tell you, like, I've been a fan of yours for so many years. I remember being in China, listening to your interview with PK Wallach and just loving your interview style, and also the Double Bass blog and what you've done there. I say it constantly, you're doing the Lord's work. And it's such, I think you probably don't realize it because you're in it day to day, but I think the reach of the work that you've done is so large and will have actually historic implications, if I may be so bold, because it's you've created this sort of one-stop resource for our community that didn't exist before, certainly not to the extent and to the quality that you've done it with. And I think that you've created something that people will be able to sort of draw from that well for generations to come.
I appreciate it, Tom. It's hard for me to like be reflective like that personally, because I'm just kind of like doing my thing, and it's funny because so much of what I do feels so solitary because it's just like me at a computer. Right. But back like 5 years ago when I was moving out here, I was trying to figure out what to do with my life, and that's why I booted the podcast back up, because I logged into my podcast statistics one day, and I hadn't even like logged in years, and I thought, look at this. Some of these things have had like 30,000, 40,000 downloads. These things I haven't even paid attention to. And that was when I was teaching high school orchestra. And I thought that, and this is sort of a cynical way, or maybe not the best way to look at it, but I thought, okay, in ideal circumstances, 200 kids a day are kind of paying attention to me, maybe, and their phone or whatever, versus I log, and I was like, oh, wow, there are like thousands of people a day that are like checking in with this stuff. So though it feels weird to say, okay, I'd rather, because I love the pace of life and the activity of whether it's teaching or playing gigs or that sort of thing. I just decided, let me just focus on this and pretend it's my job. And it's sort of, I guess it's turned into my job, which is bizarre, but. Well,
that's awesome that it has. And, it's really true that the cream rises to the top. I mean, there maybe are other people who will try to imitate what you do, but you were there at the ground floor, you invented something. And also too, I think the community has, everybody can smell out a charlatan, and you, because you're a great player, because you know what you're talking about, because your personality is such, that's why it's gained its footing. I think that's you should be really proud of it, man. I mean, it's something that's not going anywhere anytime soon, and it's only has room to grow. My students, they all know about your website and your blog and your recommendations for modacity and all these things. It's all coming from you. So it's really great. Oh, but I will. In the future, it's totally true. I'm not, if it wasn't true, I wouldn't say it. Sure. So in the future, I do want to hit you up maybe for another, not conversation, doesn't have to be, but I'm working on this really interesting project right now through Brussels Philharmonic. I've made a commission for a bass guitar concerto for bass guitar and orchestra. And that's what's kept me busy for the pandemic. Basically, as the world is burning around us, I was like, great, more time in the practice room. So I'm busy with that right now. We're going to record it in April. Once the master is done, it's going to come out on the Naxos label.
Nice.
And then I think in 2022, April, we'll premiere it live with the orchestra. But once it's recorded and I have something to show you, I can even maybe, with the permission of the composer, send you some of the parts and some of the MIDI simulation so you can get an idea of it. But it exists some things for bass guitar and orchestra, and it's great. But there's nothing that really exists from the contemporary classical perspective. Mm-hmm. And this is really coming from perspectives like classical musicians would expect. There's a real symbiosis between the instrument and the orchestra. Sometimes you'll hear something made, it's more from a jazz standpoint, or the orchestra accompaniment is a bit lacking. But I truly believe that this is going to be the first of its kind. And I think the last frontier for the bass guitar is to be taken serious as a solo instrument in a symphonic setting. And I think it deserves it. And I think this piece has the potential to do that for the instrument.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, let's definitely chat about that. I mean, I'd love to. I'm ashamed I haven't had you on the podcast yet, because I've had this database.
I'm way down the line.
No, you've been recommended, and it's one of those things. I have no plan or rhyme or reason. It's just like but please, let's as soon as that gets closer at whatever stage, let's talk about. Let's do a round 2 or a round 3 about it. I'd love to check out. Tom, you rock. Thank you so much for chatting. ThomasFiorini.com is the website that is linked up to in the show notes, along with Tom's social media. And yeah, I just really appreciate hanging out with you, Tom. And like I said in the intro, and you heard throughout the episode and are hearing now, if you got into the end here, I connected with Tom to talk about that bass sections playing late. And what I'm discovering is I'm actually really enjoying doing these interviews that are part of a larger project, which are these videos I've been doing, Stupid Bass History. Not that this is stupid or bass history, but I'll probably put it in that category, what Tom and I were talking about. But so what happens when you do something that's going to then be used as like a quote in a video is I use like a minute of this for the video, or 90 seconds maybe, or something like that. But of course, Tom and I talk for a long time, and it makes for a great podcast episode. I certainly think so anyway. So that's what you're going to be hearing for the next few episodes. Of course, we'll be going back to not things as a result of a video, but I'm enjoying doing this and sort of having a few levels to what is happening here. Yeah. That was not super well worded, but that's okay. This is outro 2 of 4, so I should be still fairly lucid, but I have had a long day anyway. And so, yeah, I should probably quit while I'm ahead, if I'm still ahead. And thank the team who puts these episodes together. They are Michael Cooper, Steve Hinchy, Mitch Mooring, Trevor Jones, and Krista Copper. Mitch makes quite the bass, award-winning basses in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Learn more at mitchmooring.com. I am your host, Jason Heath. Here we are, kicking off 2021, oh my goodness, with more life on the low end of the spectrum.